Two cameras, one quick reader. What could possibly go wrong? That's right, today we are looking at the logistics and potential pitfalls of sharing an Insta360 Quick Reader with two or more Go3 or Go3S cameras. And I have to say, the results are pretty interesting. So this is a follow-up to two videos I posted recently, the first being a review of the Insta360 Quick Reader, the second one focused on sharing an action pod between multiple Go3 and Go3S cameras. Now I got quite a few questions and comments from both of those videos asking about sharing the Quick Reader between multiple cameras, so that's what we're going to focus on today. Now there's quite a bit to cover, so as usual I'll place the chapters up here and on the video timeline, but before we get started, very important to mention, this video is not sponsored, paid for, or influenced in any way. I purchased all of the equipment with my own money and the opinions are entirely my own. And of course, if you are enjoying the video, getting good information out of it, remember to give us a like and also consider subscribing to the channel for a lot more similar content. So let's get on with it. So what are the concerns then when it comes to sharing a quick reader amongst multiple cameras? Well, in order to answer that, let's first look at what the quick reader actually does. And basically it has two key functions. Firstly, charging the camera, and secondly, transferring files off the camera. Now, when it comes to charging the camera, clearly there's no real issue here other than the fact that there's only one charger, so each camera has to wait its turn. But when it comes to file transfer, that's where there may be some areas of concern, and we'll get into the details of those concerns shortly. Now, there are three different types of file transfer supported by the Quick Reader. There is transfer to a Windows or Mac computer, you have transfer to the Insta360 app on your smartphone or tablet, and thirdly you have transfer to a memory card which is installed in the Quick Reader itself. But before we get into the different file transfer types, firstly let's take a look at how organization and file naming works on an Insta360 camera. So let's go ahead and plug my Go3S into my computer and let's take a look at what's on it. So as you can see on my Mac computer, the Go3S appears just like any other drive or memory card. I can double click to open it up and browse the contents. Now the first thing you'll see is a folder called DCIM, which simply stands for Digital Camera Images, and within that folder is another folder called Camera 01, which is where your video files are located. Now when you record a video on your Go3S, you actually get two files. You'll see here a VID file, which is the actual video, and a corresponding low resolution version, which is the LRV file, which is used for things like previews because it's faster to render. But the VID file is your actual high-resolution video file. So as you can see, I have two video files on here, and if you look at the name of the files, what you'll see is you have VID followed by the date and time when the recording was started. So checking out this particular file, as you can see, it was recorded on August 19th, 2024 at 2:45 p.m. and 18 seconds. Then continuing the file name, we have a 00, which is a carryover from Insta360's 360 cameras, and then a sequential number. Now adding this sequential number in addition to the date and time helps out when it comes to creating unique file names, which as you'll see later is very important. Okay, so we've looked at how file organization and file naming works on a Go3 and Go3S. Now we want to look at how that impacts the different file transfer modes when using our Quick Reader. In particular, we want to see how it impacts the transfer from multiple cameras. So in order to test all of that out, I made some recordings on both of these cameras. I started out with both cameras empty in order to reset the sequential file numbering, and then I made some simultaneous recordings. Now the idea, of course, being that I would create multiple files, but in particular I wanted to create at least one file with an identical name on both cameras so we could see how the different file transfer modes handled that. So let's start out then by looking at transferring files to a Windows or Mac computer, and in my case I'm going to be using the example of a Mac. So I'm going to connect the first camera to my computer, this time using the Quick Reader, but essentially this does exactly the same thing as using the Action Pod. As we saw previously, the camera appears just like a drive or memory card on my desktop, and I can browse to the video files just as I did before. Now, when transferring files in this way, obviously I have complete visibility to the files themselves and also complete control over where the files are transferred to. So in this case, I'm simply going to transfer the high-resolution video files to a folder that I've called Camera 1. Now, important to point out here also that this is a copy function that I'm using here, so the original video files are retained on the camera. Okay, so let's eject camera 1 and do the same thing with camera 2. So we simply repeat the process, but this time I transfer the video files to a folder called camera 2. Okay, now that's complete. Let's go ahead and eject camera 2 and let's take a look at what we have. So as you can see, I now have 4 high-resolution video files, and if you look carefully you'll notice that there is an identically named file in each of the 2 folders. Now clearly here this did not create any issue because I placed the files into different folders, and even if I had attempted to transfer the files into the same folder, I would have received a notification from my Windows or Mac system. So clearly then, when transferring files to a Windows or Mac computer, I have complete control over the process, so there really is no issue handling the files from multiple cameras. But let's now see how that same applies when transferring files to the Insta360 app. Okay, so now we're going to do basically the same thing, but this time we're going to use the smart reader to download the files from both cameras to my smartphone by using the Insta360 app. And just as a reminder, we still have the same files, so there are 2 video files on each camera, and of course one of those files has an identical name on each camera, and we're going to see how the Insta360 app handles that. Okay, so let's go ahead and plug in the Quick Reader to my smartphone, and I'll share my screen with you over here. As you can see, it wants me to allow the accessory, and then it launches the Insta360 app. Now I take my powered on camera, the first camera, and we place it into the Quick Reader. And if I browse over, you'll notice that there are 2 videos here on the camera, just as we saw previously. And what I'm going to do is mark them both, and I'm going to download them so they are now stored on my smartphone. Now these are fairly short videos, so that completes pretty quickly. And as you can see now on the screen, both of the videos have a little icon which is checked, showing that these have been downloaded to my device. But importantly, they are still on the camera. Just as we saw previously, this is a copy function, so it creates a copy but leaves the original files on the camera itself. So now let's head over to the download folder, and you can see here those 2 videos are now in the download folder. So what we're going to do is remove the first camera, and we're now going to take the second camera, also powered on of course, and let's see what is on this camera. two very similar looking files, of course. Now you'll already notice here that the one on the right here already has a check mark on it, indicating that it has already been downloaded. So let's see what happens when I go to download them. So once again, I'm going to select both and I'm going to download, and it adds both downloads to the queue. And again, after a few seconds, the downloads are complete. So let's go over to the download folder, and you can see I now have all 4 videos in here. Now I did try this previously, and in one other instance it told me I was not able to download the video because it was already downloaded, but it seems to be inconsistent. So right now this seems to work just fine. I don't know how it's differentiating between the 2 files with the same file name. But in any event, even if you were not able to download the duplicate video, the good news is that all original files are still on both cameras. Okay, so spoiler alert, this is where it really gets interesting, because now we're going to use the Quick Reader to transfer the contents of both cameras onto a single memory card. Now, if you want the full details on this process, check out the review video, but just very briefly, what we're going to do is place a memory card into the Quick Reader. We're going to plug it into a power source. In this case, I'm just going to use this power bank. We're going to take the powered on camera and dock it into the Quick Reader. You'll notice that the light goes green, and now a single press on the button will carry out the transfer process. And there are 2 very important things to know about this process. Number 1, it is a full sweep. You cannot choose which files are transferred and which are not. When you hit that button, the entire contents of the camera is transferred to the memory card. The second thing to know is this is a move function, not a copy function. So once this process is complete, the files will be on the memory card, but they will be deleted from the camera itself. So this is a one-way process. Okay, so before we get started, let's just confirm that we have a completely empty memory card. So I'm going to go ahead and plug it into my computer. And as you can see, no files, no folders, this card is completely empty. And if we just remind ourselves, here are the files that we previously transferred over from each camera. We have 2 files on each camera, and as we saw previously, each camera has a file with an identical file name. And of course, we want to see how the memory card transfer process copes with this. Okay, let's start out by putting the memory card into our Quick Reader, and we're going to plug it into the power source and place our first camera in place. You can see that the light has now turned green. So now I just have to press the single button, and that will transfer the entire contents of the camera onto the memory card. So let's go ahead and do that. You can see the light continues to flash, and it will beep when it is complete. There it is. So again, the files were pretty small, so it is pretty quick. So let's go ahead and remove the first one. Now, before we get to the second camera, let's go ahead and take a look at what is now on the memory card. So once again, let's insert the memory card. So as you can see, the Quick Reader has replicated the exact folder structure that we saw previously on the camera. And here you can see the 2 high-resolution videos together with their low-resolution versions. So let's go ahead and eject the memory card. Let's place the card back in the Quick Reader. And now let's do the same thing with the second camera. Wait for the light to go green, and we transfer the files. Okay, so now let's see what we have on the memory card. Now the first thing you'll notice is that the folder structure has not changed. So basically all files from all cameras are just dumped into the same folder. As a result, instead of having 4 high-resolution videos as we expected, there are now only 3. In the case of the file with the duplicate file name, the one ending 001, the file from the first camera was simply replaced and overwritten with the file of the same name from the second camera. So let's just recap then. When you're using the Quick Reader in order to transfer files from multiple cameras to a single memory card, there are 2 key issues. Firstly, the fact that all files from all cameras end up being dumped into the same folder, which in itself is a big inconvenience. As a result, you may end up with a lot more work trying to figure out which files belong to which camera. But clearly the bigger issue is that of the identical file names. If there is a file already on the memory card and another file with the same file name is transferred onto the memory card, it will simply overwrite the existing file and you will lose that file. And just remember, based on the way this process works, you will not have a backup file remaining on your camera. So I think a key question to answer at this point is, how likely is it that you end up with different files on different cameras with an identical file name? So let's think about it for a moment. In order to end up with 2 different files on 2 different cameras sharing the same file name, 2 things have to happen. Firstly, the recording needs to be started on both cameras at the exact same time, down to the second. If that's the case, then the date and time portion of the file name will of course be the same. And in addition to that, both cameras need to have the same number of files already stored on them, and if that is the case, then the sequential number portion of the file name will also be the same, and now we have identical file names. So how likely is it then that these 2 different things will coincide and we end up with identical file names? Well, like many things, it depends on how you're using the multiple cameras. Well, first off, let's assume the situation where you have 2 different cameras being used completely independently. In that situation, it is extremely unlikely that you would end up with identical file names on both cameras. But here's the thing, it is still possible. And I would say if I am backing up 2 different cameras to the same memory card, I'm not sure I want to take the risk of losing some of my files because there just happen to be some identical file names. On the other hand, very often the reason for using multiple cameras is to capture different angles or different perspectives of the same event. And in that kind of situation, you generally want these to be synchronized. In fact, as you may be aware, you can even link multiple cameras to the same remote control in order to do that. And in that type of situation, you are almost guaranteed to end up with identical file names on both cameras. Now, the reason I say almost guaranteed is because in my testing, I did determine that there seems to be a random delay between the time you hit the record button, whether it's on the remote or on the camera, and when the recording actually starts. So technically, an identical file name is not guaranteed, but let's be honest, it's going to happen, and I don't think anybody is going to take that risk. So let's talk about some solutions, which of course would need to come from Insta360, and maybe some workarounds that we can use in the meantime. So as far as solutions from Insta360 are concerned, I think there are several that we could look at, and I think for the most part these could be implemented fairly easily by way of firmware upgrades. First of all, they could look at updating the actual transfer process itself so it would recognize duplicate files and simply not transfer over a file with the same name, or transfer it over and somehow edit the name so it could be clearly recognized as a duplicate. Second, perhaps they could update the process so that it would recognize the camera, perhaps by its serial number, and then create a folder specifically for each camera. And thirdly, an option I would definitely like to see on the Go 3 and Go 3S, give users the ability to create custom file naming. That would allow users to create their own custom file names for each camera, making it easier to recognize which file came from which camera and of course avoid duplicate file names. But until we get some of these updates, what are some of the workarounds that we could use to avoid some of these issues? Well, firstly, and perhaps the most simple solution, is don't transfer files from multiple cameras to the same memory card. Instead, use specific memory cards for each camera. That would involve obviously some organization and some discipline, maybe even having to label your memory card so you know which one is the right one. But of course, even then, there is the danger that you may press that button when the wrong memory card happens to be in the Quick Reader. Now, an alternative to using different memory cards is to simply ensure that we don't end up with duplicate file names. Now, one obvious way to do this is simply to start the recording on one camera a few seconds before you start it on the second camera, and that way you ensure that at least the date and time portion of the file name is different. Now, if that's not an option and you want to make sure they are synchronized, or maybe you're using a remote to start and stop them both, there is still a way that you can ensure that the file names are not the same, and that simply involves getting the sequential numbering out of sync. So for example, if I have two empty cameras ready to go and I want to use them completely synchronized, all I need to do is to make a single recording on this camera, and that way the sequential numbering is now out of sync. Now, I would actually advise you do more than one recording, because otherwise one single accidental triggering of the second camera puts the sequential numbering back in sync. So perhaps take 5 to 10 recordings on one camera before you start. Now, you don't have to spend a lot of time or use up a lot of your memory card doing multiple 4K recordings. You could also just use still images. Any file type will increase that sequential numbering sequence. So that about covers it for today when it comes to sharing a Quick Reader amongst multiple Go 3 and Go 3S cameras. I hope you enjoyed the video and got good information out of it. If so, remember to give us a like and consider subscribing to the channel. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you have suggestions for follow-up or future videos, please drop those into the comments section. Otherwise, thanks again for watching.